This is Bobby Orr, the defenseman who was never supposed to be a forward threat. Coaches told him to stay back, play safe, and protect his own zone. That was the role of a defenseman, but Bobby refused to stay in that box. Instead, he skated faster, attacked harder, and changed hockey forever. He turned defense into offense, blurring the lines of what his position was even meant to be. In a time when defensemen were expected to be barriers, Orr became a creator. He scored goals that looked impossible, rushed end to end as if the ice belonged only to him, and shattered records that no defenseman had ever touched before. His style wasn't just different, it was revolutionary. If Bobby Orr had listened to those who told him to hold back, the NHL might never have seen the rise of the modern two-way superstar. The sport could have stayed locked in its old ways, where defensemen stayed in the shadows and never dared to carry the spotlight. But Orr showed the world that greatness comes from breaking rules, not following them. He wasn't supposed to change hockey, but he did, and the game was never the same. If Bobby Orr had given in to the voices telling him to play safe, the game of hockey would look completely different today. The world would never have seen a defenseman rush up the ice like a forward, scoring goals as if he were born to attack. Fans would never have witnessed those breathtaking plays, where Orr seemed to glide past everyone, changing the speed of the game in a single stride. Without him, defensemen might have remained background players, nameless and faceless, remembered only for clearing the puck and blocking shots. Think about it. Orr wasn't just a great player. He became the blueprint for an entire new kind of athlete. His success opened the door for future stars like Paul Coffey, Ray Bourque, and later on, offensive-minded defensemen who dared to carry the puck and take risks. If Orr had never broken free from the old way of playing, kids growing up might never have dreamed of becoming defensemen. They would have wanted only to be flashy forwards, leaving the blue line as a place for players with no creativity. Orr's presence gave hockey moments that still echoed decades later. His famous flying goal in 1970 is not just an image on a poster, it is the symbol of a sport lifted into a new era. And beyond the trophies, the records, and the highlights, there's a bigger truth. Hockey needed him. The game was ready for change, but only someone bold enough to risk failure could make it happen. Bobby Orr was that someone. Without him, the sport might have stayed stuck in the past. Bobby Orr's story begins in a small town on the shores of Georgian Bay in Ontario, Canada. The place was called Parry Sound, a quiet little community surrounded by water, trees, and open skies. It was the kind of town where everybody knew each other, and winters meant one thing above all else: hockey. In Parry Sound, kids grew up with skates strapped to their feet, and frozen ponds were as important as classrooms. For Bobby, those ponds weren't just a playground, they were the start of a revolution. From a young age, people noticed something different about him. He wasn't the biggest kid on the ice. In fact, compared to many of the other boys, Bobby looked smaller, even fragile at times. But the moment he touched the puck, something changed. His speed set him apart. While others skated in stiff, straight lines, Bobby seemed to glide. He could weave in and out, darting past kids who were taller and stronger. It was almost as if the ice gave him wings. Neighbors recalled seeing him out there for hours, racing from one end of the frozen pond to the other, refusing to stop even when the cold bit into his face. His family wasn't wealthy, but they gave him everything they could to support his love for the game. Bobby's father, Doug, had been a decent hockey player himself and quickly saw that his son had something rare. He made sure Bobby had skates, sticks, and the encouragement to keep playing, even when it wasn't easy. His mother, Arva, worried about how rough the sport could be, but she couldn't ignore the spark of joy her son had every time he hit the ice. By the time Bobby was just 9 years old, local coaches had already begun to talk about him. The Parry Sound Bantams, a youth team, put him on their roster even though he was younger than most of the players. That didn't matter. What mattered was that every time Bobby got the puck, the game seemed to change. He didn't just defend, he attacked. He didn't just skate, he flew. There's a story of one early coach who said, he wasn't the biggest, but he skated like no one else. You couldn't teach that. It was natural. It wasn't only his speed that amazed people, it was his fearlessness. Most kids hesitated when racing toward older, tougher opponents, but Bobby didn't blink. He rushed straight at them, using his quickness to slip past hits and check attempts. It wasn't that he wanted to show off, it was that he played without fear, without the thought that he should hold back. Even then, as just a boy from a small town, he was already breaking rules of what a defenseman was supposed to be. The word about Bobby spread quickly beyond Parry Sound. Scouts began to take notice, and before long, people outside the little town were whispering about the kid with the golden skates. They said he wasn't ordinary. They said if he kept growing, if he kept pushing himself, he could be something special. But at that point, no one could imagine just how much he would change the entire game. For Bobby, though, it wasn't about fame or the future. He was just a boy in love with hockey, spending endless hours on the ice, wearing out sticks, and skating until his legs burned. The rink was where he felt most alive. And it was in those long winters of Parry Sound that the legend of Bobby Orr first began to take shape. Before we keep going, if you're enjoying this story of Bobby Orr changing hockey forever, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us bring you more deep dives on legends like this. When Bobby Orr began moving up through the ranks of hockey, the excitement around him was clear, but so were the doubts. For all of his talent, many people believed he was too small to survive in a game that was becoming faster and more physical every year. At the time, defensemen were expected to be big and heavy, the kind of players who could clear out the crease with brute strength. Bobby didn't fit that mold. He was wiry, quick, and looked more like a speedster than a wall of muscle. Coaches, reporters, and even opposing players would shake their heads and say he wouldn't last against the punishment of the NHL. The other obstacle was the old-fashioned mindset about how defensemen should play. The role had always been simple: stay back, guard your zone, and let the forwards handle the scoring. Bobby's natural instinct was the complete opposite. When he wanted to carry the puck, lead the rush, and take risks most defensemen never dreamed of. This worried many traditionalists. To them, his style was reckless. They warned that playing that way would lead to turnovers, mistakes, and embarrassment. Some even suggested he would ruin his career if he didn't learn to stay in his lane. On top of the criticism, Bobby faced a challenge that would follow him for much of his career: injuries. Even as a teenager, the physical toll of the sport began testing his body. His knees, in particular, which he relied on for that explosive skating stride, started to show signs of strain. Doctors and coaches told him to slow down, to play safer, but Bobby wasn't wired that way. Every time he fell, he got up. Every time pain made it hard to skate, he pushed harder. For him, the idea of holding back wasn't an option. The physical punishment wasn't the only test. Bobby also had to prove himself in locker rooms filled with older players who didn't take it easy on the young kid. As the youngest on the ice, he was often targeted in practices and games. Opponents hit him harder, trying to intimidate him, but instead of shying away, Bobby absorbed it. He didn't fight back with fists. He fought back by skating faster, creating plays, and showing that no matter how many times he was knocked down, he would still find a way to beat them. What separated Bobby from others wasn't just his skill, but his stubborn drive. He refused to let critics write his story for him. When people said he was too small, he outskated men twice his size. When they said defensemen weren't supposed to attack, he proved them wrong by creating scoring chances from the back end. When injuries tried to limit him, he trained harder and played through pain most people couldn't imagine. One story that stuck with those around him was how much extra time he spent on the ice after practice. While others left, Bobby stayed, circling the rink again and again, testing himself until his legs burned. For him, exhaustion was not an excuse. It was proof that he was getting stronger. His teammates began to notice that the kid from Parry Sound was not only talented, but relentless. This period of doubt and challenge shaped his character. Bobby learned early that greatness comes with resistance. Every no he heard became fuel. Every injury became a test of how badly he wanted it. Instead of breaking him, the obstacles made him stronger. By the time he was ready to join the NHL, he wasn't just a talented skater, he was a fighter who had already proved that he would not back down, no matter the cost. The real turning point in Bobby Orr's journey came when the Boston Bruins decided to take a chance on him. At the time, the Bruins were a struggling franchise. They hadn't won much in years, and their fan base was growing restless. The team needed something new, something bold, that could breathe life back into the organization. Scouts had been watching Bobby since he was a boy in Parry Sound, amazed by how he carried the puck and controlled games, and the Bruins were convinced he was worth the risk. Still, there was hesitation. Drafting Orr meant betting on a player who didn't play like a traditional defenseman. Boston's front office knew critics would call it reckless. A defenseman who refused to stay back was unheard of in the NHL. But the Bruins decided that if they wanted to rebuild their future, they needed someone who could change the way the game was played. So in 1966, when Orr joined the Bruins for his first NHL season at age 18, the team placed its future in the hands of a teenager who had already shown he wouldn't follow the rules others lived by. The choice didn't just test Boston's faith, it tested Bobby himself. The pressure was enormous. Here he was, barely out of his teens, wearing the jersey of one of the NHL's oldest franchises, and the weight of an entire rebuild rested on his shoulders. Coaches warned him to play safe, to focus on his defensive duties first. They told him that his end-to-end rushes might look exciting, but they could also leave his team vulnerable. For most players, this advice would have been enough to make them change. But Bobby refused to conform. He believed that if he tried to play safe, he would never be the player he was meant to be. He wanted to take the puck, charge up the ice, and force the game to bend to his style. Every time he skated, he was making a choice, to follow the old rules or to take the risk of rewriting them, and he chose the risk. Looking back, it's clear how fragile that moment really was. Everything could have ended if Bobby had decided to play the game the way others expected. He might have become just another good defenseman, steady but forgettable. Instead, By daring to play his own way, he became the spark that reignited the Bruins and set hockey on a new path. It was at this crossroads, as a teenager in Boston, that Bobby Orr decided he would not only play the game, he would change it forever. Bobby Orr's rookie season in 1966-67 wasn't just the start of a career, it was the start of a revolution. From the moment he stepped onto the ice in a Boston Bruins sweater, fans knew they were watching something different. Rookie defensemen were supposed to be cautious, focused on steady play, and maybe take years to grow into leaders. Or skip that process entirely. He burst into the NHL with a style that was fearless, fast, and unforgettable. In his very first season, he recorded 13 goals and 28 assists for 41 points. For a defenseman in that era, those numbers were unheard of. Most blue liners measured success in blocked shots and safe passes, not offensive production. But Orr skated as if he had no limits. He carried the puck end to end, rushing past players who could only spin around and chase his shadow. Fans inside Boston Garden gasped every time he touched the puck because they knew something extraordinary might happen. It wasn't only the fans who noticed, it was the opponents too. Veteran forwards, some of the toughest and most skilled in the league, admitted that they had never seen a defenseman play this way. One rival was quoted saying, "You had to keep your head on a swivel with Orr. He came flying from anywhere, and you never knew how to stop him." The old rulebooks on how to defend a defenseman no longer worked. Sports writers, who at first doubted whether a skinny kid could handle the NHL, quickly changed their tone. Headlines began praising his skating, his vision, and his fearlessness. The Boston Globe called him the future of hockey before his rookie season even ended. His impact was so undeniable that despite playing for a Bruins team that still struggled in the standings, Orr won the Calder Trophy as the NHL's Rookie of the Year. What made his season so special wasn't just the points he scored, but how he scored them. Orr didn't wait for the game to come to him. He took control of it. One night, he would dart through 3 defenders to set up a goal. Another night, he would fire a booming slap shot from the blue line that left the goalie frozen. He wasn't a defenseman trying to imitate a forward. He was something entirely new, a hybrid that had never existed before. The crowds in Boston, who had endured years of disappointment, finally had a reason to believe again. Every time Orr jumped on the ice, he gave them hope. Children began copying his skating style on frozen ponds. Older fans who had seen generations of players admitted they had never witnessed anything like him. It wasn't just that he was good, it was that he played with a freedom and joy that reminded people why they loved hockey in the first place. Even with injuries nagging him during that rookie campaign, Orr showed a toughness that matched his brilliance. He blocked shots, absorbed punishing hits, and still got up to make plays. Reporters marveled that someone so young could carry himself with the composure of a veteran while playing with the energy of a teenager. It was that blend of skill, courage, and determination that set him apart. By the end of his first season, the NHL wasn't just talking about Bobby Orr, they were already rewriting what was possible for the position he played. The Bruins still had a long road ahead, but everyone could sense that something bigger was coming. Bobby Orr had announced himself, not quietly, but with the kind of thunder that made it impossible to ignore. For all the brilliance Bobby Orr showed in his first years, the game took a heavy toll on him. His knees, the very engines of his skating power, became his greatest weakness. From the late 1960s onward, Orr was often playing hurt. Behind the dazzling rushes and highlight goals, there was constant pain. Time and again, doctors warned him to slow down or risk permanent damage. But slowing down wasn't in his nature. He kept pushing, and with every push, the pressure on his knees grew worse. The media began to notice. At first, Orr was hailed as the unstoppable force who would carry Boston into a new era. But soon, questions filled the newspapers. Could he last? Was his body too fragile to handle the physical demands of his unique style? Reporters speculated whether his fearless skating was shortening his career, even as it made him legendary. The headlines started to shift tone, one day celebrating his brilliance, the next worrying he might not be around long enough to cement his place in history. Fans, too, felt the weight of these doubts. Every time Orr limped off the ice or missed games, Boston held its breath. They feared the worst, that this once-in-a-lifetime talent would be taken from the game far too soon. The anxiety wasn't unfounded. By the age of 22, Orr had already undergone multiple surgeries on his knees. In an era when medical technology was limited, each operation carried risks, and each comeback seemed to borrow against the future. Opponents didn't make it easy on him either. Knowing that his knees were vulnerable, rival players often targeted him with brutal checks and punishing hits. Some tried to slow him down physically, figuring that if they couldn't outskate him, they could at least wear him down. Orr absorbed these blows with determination, but the damage built over time. He was still young, but his body carried scars more common to aging veterans. The criticism wasn't just about his health, it also touched on his style. Traditionalists continued to argue that Orr was too reckless, that his end-to-end rushes were exciting but dangerous for both him and his team. Whenever the Bruins lost a game, critics pointed to his aggressive approach as the problem, saying a defenseman's first job should never be to score goals. The louder his success became, the sharper the criticism from those who couldn't accept change. And yet, Bobby never let these doubts define him. Even when the media questioned his durability, even when fans feared the curtain was falling too soon, he carried himself with quiet confidence. He didn't lash out at reporters or argue with critics. Instead, he let his play answer. Whenever he returned from surgery or fought through pain to dominate a game, he reminded the world that he wasn't finished. Still, the fear of what might be lost never went away. Boston fans loved him deeply, but every cheer carried a little worry. How much longer could he do this? They had seen players rise and fall before, but Orr wasn't just another star. He was their hope, their revolution, their reason to believe again. The thought of losing him too early felt unbearable. This chapter of his career was bittersweet. On one hand, he was building a legend with every stride. On the other, his body was betraying him far too soon. The struggle between brilliance and fragility became part of his story, a reminder that even the greatest athletes live on the edge of triumph and tragedy. By the late 1960s, Bobby Orr had already proven he was no ordinary rookie, but it was in the seasons that followed when he truly stepped into stardom, not just as one of the best players of his time, but as a phenomenon the sport had never seen before. The doubters had questioned his size, his health, and his style, yet his response was simple: domination. The proof came in the form of trophies. The Norris Trophy, awarded to the NHL's best defenseman, became almost his personal property. Orr won his first Norris in 1967-68, his second season in the league, and from that point forward, he made history. He didn't just win it once or twice, he captured the award 8 years in a row. No one had ever seen that kind of sustained excellence at the position. It wasn't just that he was the best defenseman of his era, he redefined what best defenseman even meant. What made his run so staggering was how he combined defensive reliability with offensive brilliance. He still blocked shots, shut down top forwards, and played with toughness, but at the same time, he was scoring at a rate that no defenseman had ever touched. In the 1969-70 season, he recorded 120 points, the first defenseman in NHL history to break the 100-point barrier. Fans and reporters struggled to process it. A blue liner was now leading the league in scoring, something once thought impossible. This dominance wasn't a fluke. Night after night, Orr controlled games from start to finish. When he had the puck, he dictated the pace, deciding whether the Bruins would slow it down or turn it into a track meet. Opponents admitted that game planning for Boston often came down to a single question: how do we stop Orr? But most nights they couldn't. His skating was too explosive, his vision too sharp, his instincts too advanced. The offensive numbers kept climbing. In 1970, Orr not only won the Norris Trophy, but he also claimed the Hart Trophy as league MVP and the Art Ross Trophy as the league's top scorer. No defenseman had ever done that before. The image of a blue liner leading the entire NHL in points seemed like something out of a dream. Orr shattered the old belief that defensemen were support players. He showed they could dominate the game's biggest spotlight. For the fans in Boston, his rise was electric. The Bruins, once seen as a struggling franchise, now had the most exciting player in the world. Crowds at the Boston Garden roared every time he touched the puck, expecting magic. Kids in Massachusetts and beyond laced up their skates pretending to be Bobby Orr, trying to mimic his fearless rushes and his powerful slap shot. Opponents were left in awe. Veteran players, who had battled against legends like Gordie Howe and Beliveau, admitted that Orr was something different. One rival summed it up bluntly: "You didn't just play against Orr, you survived him." The respect he commanded was universal. Even those who wanted desperately to beat him couldn't help but admire what he brought to the game. What made Orr's stardom unique was that it went beyond skill. He wasn't flashy for the sake of being flashy, and he didn't seek the spotlight. He played with joy, humility, and a team-first mindset that made him beloved not just in Boston, but across the league. Fans didn't just see a superstar, they saw someone who seemed grounded, who played for the love of the game rather than the attention. That made his stardom even more powerful. By the early 1970s, the argument was over. Bobby Orr wasn't just another great player, and he wasn't even just the best defenseman. He was a phenomenon, a once-in-a-lifetime talent whose impact could be measured in trophies, records, and unforgettable plays. Every Norris Trophy he added to his shelf, every season where he rewrote the record books, was another piece of evidence that hockey had entered a new age, the Bobby Orr era. By 1970, Bobby Orr had moved beyond being just a star. He had reached a level of greatness that turned him into a living legend. His rise wasn't only about awards or statistics, it was about moments that defined the sport forever. And the clearest of those moments came on May 10th, 1970, in Game 4 of the Stanley Cup Final. The Bruins were facing the St. Louis Blues, and Boston had the chance to clinch the cup on home ice. The game went into overtime, tension hanging heavy in the air. Just 40 seconds into the extra frame, Orr took a pass from Derek Sanderson, slipped past defenseman Noel Picard, and fired the puck past goalie Glenn Hall. As the puck crossed the line, Picard's stick tangled Orr's skates, sending him flying through the air. The image of Bobby Orr soaring horizontally, arms raised in triumph, became the single most famous photograph in hockey history. It wasn't just a goal, it was a symbol. That moment captured everything he represented: skill, speed, daring, and joy. With that goal, Boston won its first Stanley Cup in 29 years. The city erupted in celebration, and Orr became the face of the franchise, the savior who had brought glory back to a team long starved for it. But his peak didn't stop there. The Bruins, powered by his leadership and brilliance, lifted the cup again in 1972. That run proved the first championship wasn't luck or a one-time miracle. Orr scored the cup-clinching goal once more in the 1972 final against the New York Rangers, sealing another Conn Smythe trophy as playoff MVP. To this day, very few players have ever won the Conn Smythe back-to-back. Orr's greatness wasn't limited to regular season awards, he was just as dominant when the pressure was highest. What made his peak so remarkable was that he didn't just play better than others, he seemed to play a different sport altogether. Orr could shut down an opponent in his own end, retrieve the puck, and seconds later be leading a rush that ended with a scoring chance at the other end. The traditional separation between defense and offense didn't exist when he was on the ice. He blurred every line, creating a brand of hockey that nobody had seen before. The numbers from this period still leave people shaking their heads. Orr scored over 100 points 6 times as a defenseman, something no one else has come close to matching. In the 1970-71 season, he tallied 139 points, a total that remains the highest ever by a defenseman. That year he also finished with a plus 124 plus minus rating, another record that has never been touched. Forwards struggled to hit those numbers, yet here was a player whose first responsibility was supposed to be stopping goals, not scoring them. Perhaps just as impressive was who he outshone to get there. He wasn't dominating a weak league, he was doing it against Hall of Famers, players like Gordie Howe, Phil Esposito, and Stan Mikita. Even surrounded by giants of the game, Orr stood apart. Phil Esposito, his teammate and one of the NHL's greatest scorers, once admitted that Orr was the engine of the entire team. "I scored the goals, but Bobby made the game happen." Fans knew they were watching history unfold. Every game felt like it might deliver another unforgettable highlight. The atmosphere in Boston Garden was electric, with chants of "Orr! Orr! Orr!" echoing through the rafters. Tickets were sold out, and kids across New England skated with the number 4 stitched onto their sweaters. For a city that had long seen hockey as an afterthought, Orr turned the Bruins into Boston's heartbeat. The Garden became a place where magic felt guaranteed as long as he was on the ice. His impact spread beyond Boston. In Canada, he became a national hero, representing the perfect blend of toughness and talent. Across the border in the United States, his play turned casual fans into hockey diehards. Even in Europe and the Soviet Union, where hockey had a different style, coaches and players studied his game. Orr showed that defensemen didn't have to be static barriers. They could drive the offense, lead the attack, and thrill crowds. His style didn't just dominate the NHL, it influenced the global direction of the sport. The respect Orr commanded from fellow players made his peak all the more remarkable. Gordie Howe, who had defined hockey excellence for decades, called him the best player he had ever seen. Teammates described him as unstoppable, and coaches around the league admitted they had no strategy for containing him. One rival said it plainly: nobody had ever seen a defenseman do this, and nobody has matched him since. In those years, Orr wasn't just a hockey player, he was hockey itself. His speed, vision, and courage created a standard so high that even today, more than 50 years later, players are still measured against him. For Boston fans, his peak years were a golden age, a time when stepping into the arena meant witnessing greatness every single night. For the sport as a whole, his dominance rewrote the definition of what greatness looked like. He didn't just raise the bar, he built an entirely new one. By the time Bobby Orr reached the height of his career, he was no longer just a hockey player, he had become a cultural icon. In Canada, his name carried a special weight. To many, he represented the very spirit of the game. Kids from coast to coast looked up to him, taping number 4 on their jerseys, practicing his rushing style on frozen ponds, and dreaming that one day they could fly across the ice the way he did. In small towns and big cities alike, children didn't just want to play hockey, they wanted to play like Bobby Orr. What made him even more admired was the way he carried himself off the ice. Unlike some superstars who chased attention or controversy, Orr kept a clean image. He was humble, respectful, and modest in victory. Reporters often remarked that he seemed uncomfortable talking about his own achievements. He would rather give credit to his teammates or downplay his brilliance. This humility only added to his myth. Fans didn't just cheer for him because he was great, they respected him because he acted like a true gentleman. Orr also became a face of the game beyond the rink. His popularity led to endorsements that stretched far outside hockey arenas. He appeared in commercials, magazine features, and even promotional campaigns that introduced the sport to wider audiences. But unlike many athletes, he never let fame overshadow the purity of his love for hockey. Even in advertisements, his image was tied to hard work, dedication, and honesty, qualities parents wanted their children to learn from. In Boston, where hockey had once struggled for attention, Orr turned the Bruins into the city's pride. In Canada, he was treated like a national treasure, someone who carried the country's favorite sport on his shoulders. And internationally, he was the face people associated with hockey's excitement. People who didn't even follow the game knew who Bobby Orr was, because his reputation reached far beyond the scoreboard. Perhaps the greatest measure of his cultural impact was how he inspired a new generation. Young defensemen who came after him didn't want to stay back and play cautiously, they wanted to join the rush, to score, to create. Players across the NHL admitted they copied Orr's fearless style as kids. He had made the role of defenseman something to aspire to, not avoid. His influence lived not just in statistics, but in the dreams of the children who tried to be him. Bobby Orr's cultural presence proved that legends aren't just built on championships or records. They are built on the way people feel when they see greatness. For kids, parents, and fans everywhere, he wasn't simply a hockey player. He was a hero who showed that humility and brilliance could live in the same person, and that combination made him unforgettable. As bright as Bobby Orr's rise had been, the decline came far too soon, and it was heartbreaking to watch. The same knees that gave him the speed to revolutionize hockey were the very thing that betrayed him. By his mid-20s, Orr had already undergone multiple surgeries. Each procedure brought him back for a time, but each one also took a little more from his body. Fans could see it, the bursts of speed weren't quite as effortless, the recoveries after hits took longer, and the limp after games became harder to hide. The Bruins tried to manage his workload, but Orr only knew how to play one way, all out. Holding back wasn't in his nature. That determination made him great, but it also accelerated the damage. By the mid-1970s, his knees were deteriorating so quickly that doctors warned him he might never skate pain-free again. Yet, even as the pain worsened, Orr refused to give in easily. He kept returning to the ice, each time greeted with standing ovations, as if the crowd knew they were witnessing borrowed time. In 1976, after years of carrying the Bruins, Orr made the difficult decision to leave Boston and join the Chicago Blackhawks. For fans in Boston, it felt like a piece of their soul had been ripped away. But even in Chicago, his health didn't hold. He played only a handful of games, his body simply unable to keep up with the demands of the NHL. The sight of Orr limping through practices, fighting for every stride, was painful for everyone who had once seen him fly across the ice. What made it so tragic was the contrast between his peak and his decline. Just a few years earlier, he had been unstoppable, rewriting record books, dominating playoffs, making crowds believe in miracles. Now, before he had even turned 30, he was being forced to consider life after hockey. Fans struggled to accept it. How could someone who had changed the sport so completely be finished so quickly? Many wondered what more he could have achieved if his body had held together. The end came quietly, compared to the noise of his greatness. Orr officially retired in 1979 at the age of 30. Most players peak around that age, but for Orr, it was the end. His career had lasted only 12 seasons, and though those years were filled with achievements that would last forever, the brevity of it left a lingering sadness. Hockey had witnessed something extraordinary, but only in flashes compared to what might have been. For fans, his decline was more than disappointing, it was devastating. Generations would talk about how they felt cheated, not by Orr himself, but by fate. They had seen a player unlike any other, but they knew they had lost him far too soon. The same flying leap that made him immortal in 1970 also came to symbolize how fleeting his brilliance would be. Bobby Orr's decline reminded everyone that even legends cannot outrun time. His knees broke down, his career was cut short, and fans were left mourning what could have been. Yet, even in that sadness, there was gratitude. For however short his time was, it was enough to change hockey forever. They said a defenseman's job was to stay back, to clear the puck, to protect the crease while letting the forwards chase glory. But Bobby Orr proved a defenseman could fly. He proved that one player, even from the back line, could lift a team, a city, and an entire sport into a new era. His skates carried him far beyond what anyone thought possible, and in doing so, he changed the very meaning of his position. Orr didn't just collect trophies, he collected moments that became immortal. The soaring goal in 1970, the dominance of the Norris trophies, the way he skated past entire teams as if they were standing still. Each of these memories lives on because they weren't just about winning. They were about redefining what hockey could be. For young players, he opened doors that had never existed before. For fans, he gave hope, joy, and pride. Even though injuries cut his career short, the impact he left was larger than any record book could capture. His legacy isn't measured only in numbers, but in the way he inspired generations. Kids who grew up pretending to be Bobby Orr became the stars who carried the game forward. Coaches redesigned their systems because of him. Fans kept his posters on their walls long after he retired, and 50 years later, his name is still mentioned whenever people talk about the greatest to ever play. Bobby Orr didn't just play hockey, he changed hockey. His story is a reminder that greatness often comes from refusing to follow the rules written before you. He wasn't supposed to lead the rush. He wasn't supposed to score like a forward. He wasn't supposed to last as long as he did. And yet, he did all of it, and more. And that's the story of Bobby Orr. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like and subscribe, and check out our next video on another legend.